Today's spotlight for Black History Month is on Mary McLeod Bethune. She was everything. She was an educator, a philanthropist, humanitarian, a feminist, civil rights activist. She did everything. She was one of probably the most influential women of the civil rights movement, and a lot of people still haven't heard of her. And I truly think it's high time that is corrected. She said, "Next to God, we're indebted to women, first for life itself, and then for making it worth living." She is a testament to the power of women and definitely someone example who we should follow. Dr. Bethune was born in 1875 as the 15th of 17 children to parents who had been enslaved. Like many formerly enslaved people, they didn't have a ton of options in the South, and so they had continued to work on the same plantation after the Civil War ended. But they were able to buy a plot of land for themselves, and they raised their family there. They taught their children about the resistance to slavery and how important the fight for abolition was, something that Mary said really inspired her to work towards equality. Growing up in South Carolina, Mary unfortunately was not a stranger to racism. At a very young age, she was discriminated against, and her intelligence was in question because she was African American. She unfortunately watched violence happen to African American men simply because they did not act subservient to white men, making her long for equality and thirst for education because she knew that that was something that could make things better. In fact, she was one of her only siblings who became educated in a school. So during the day, she would learn, and then she'd come home, and she would teach her other siblings how to read and write. After finishing her education, Mary decided to become a teacher. She began teaching in Sumter County, South Carolina, and later relocated to Augusta, Georgia. One of her mentors, Lucy Craft Laney, really instilled in Mary this idea that, number one, teaching character was very, very important, and that girls needed a practical education, even though that was something that was not really considered to be a priority of society at the time. Mary saw just how impactful it was to arm students for real-life challenges that they would face, and it kind of influenced her to continue her emphasis on educating girls and women to include the conditions of society, particularly Black society at large. This also kind of spun her in the direction of political activism as well. In 1898, Mary got married, and her husband decided that they should move to Florida, so they did. Mary was asked to run a school while she was there, and so she did that very well. However, she really wanted the opportunity to open a school for girls. She decided to move to Daytona, where there was more economic opportunity, and she hustled. And by 1904, she was able to open up her very first school, the Educational Industrial Training School for Girls. Her first class had 6 students, 5 girls, and then her son. In order to keep the school running, Mary did everything she possibly could. She sold baked goods. She got some donations. She would trade education for labor. She did just about everything she could to make sure that her school would continue and function. After 2 years of operation, there were over 250 students at her school. Mary wanted to keep growing her institute, and so she kept on hustling, and she made a lot of connections with some very wealthy people and some powerful people as well. One of the highlights of her hustling career was when she got a donation of $62,000 from John Rockefeller. And then she also had close ties with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And those connections helped make the school successful. In 1923, her school merged with Cookman Institute, and it became the very first Black college in Florida. Now it's known as Bethune-Cookman University. Even with all of this, Mary was still a huge leader in the civil rights movement. When the 19th Amendment was passed, she fought effortlessly to help African American people gain access to voting polls despite racist policies in southern states. When she took the lead of the National Association of Colored Women to help and enforce voting rights for African Americans, she was threatened by members of the KKK for all of her outspoken work. But she didn't let that stop her, and in fact, she started to gather some national attention. She was even appointed to the Child Welfare Conference by Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover appointed her to a White House conference on child health. In the South, she kept working with different organizations to try and push for equality, especially when it came to voting rights. Some of the groups tried to be more intersectional and worked with white women to try and come up with some common ground. The white women were very resistant to African American voting, and so that made things very difficult. Shame on them. But Mary never backed down, and she didn't stop. Even across the South, as racist policies were implemented to disenfranchise Black voters, she continued to fight for her rights and for the rights of all African American people to vote. When World War II broke out, Mary continued to push to show the equality of African American women. She served as a special appointee on several different organizational chairs, as well as the special assistant to the Secretary of War. Franklin Roosevelt also saw just how talented Mary was, and so when he created the National Youth Administration under the Works Progress Administration, he specifically found a job for Mary to kind of help include African Americans and other minority groups within those programs. She was appointed to the director of the Division for African American Affairs, becoming the very first African American woman as a division head in federal government. She used her position to find jobs for African American people, showing the equality of the work that they could provide. She knew the worth of people. She said, "Invest in the human soul. Who knows? It might be a diamond in the rough." She understood the value of humanity and of people and of coming together to make changes, something that is just as important now as it was during her lifetime.